Alright folks, this is Grunch, and I am back with more Gatecrash draft previews. This time we have the black cards, the Orzhov cards, and the colorless/artifact cards. First card up, kind of a clunker, Armored Transport, 3 colorless, artifact creature, 2/1. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to Armored Transport by creatures blocking it. So this guy is a 2/1 for 3 who can mindlessly Alpha Strike, which means he's a marginal card for the Boros decks, and everywhere else he's just kind of a turd. A little bit better now, we have Balustrade Spy. 3 colorless and a black for a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, your opponent mills until they reveal a land. So, 2/3 flyer for 4 is not insane, but not terrible either. 2/3 with not flying for 3, no flying for 3 would be an okay creature, and flying for an extra mana is sort of okay. But I think this guy's really going to shine in that Dimir Milieu deck, where the enter the battlefield trigger here is quite useful. Outside of that, he's just a slightly overcosted guy. A far more impressive creature in Basilicus Creature, a colorless and a black for a 1/2 flyer with Extort. So Extort is a pretty powerful mechanic. If you haven't played with it yet, didn't get to play at the pre-release, it may be fully hard to appreciate, but it is quite good. The fact that this is a cheap creature is good, particularly because it makes him a good target for Cypher spells, which we'll see several of in this video. And as a cheap evasion guy, he triggers your Cypher. He puts on a mild clock, but then continues to extort for Orzhov decks, so I think this is kind of one of your bread and butter commons for the black guilds in this set. Much more of a niche card, we move on to Beckon Apparition, a black and white hybrid mana for an instant that exiles a card from a graveyard and puts a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token into the battlefield. So you have to want a Suntail Hawk really badly to want this, and you also have to want Cremate pretty desperately. There are a couple of very, very marginal reasons to want a Cremate, but really this is kind of just a last pick in a pack and a very narrow sideboard card. Moving along, we come to an interesting creature, the Cartel Aristocrat, 1 white mana, 1 black mana, a 2/2, and you may sacrifice another creature to have it gain protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So this is kind of interesting. It's awkward protection. Protecting a grizzly bear isn't exactly the best thing that you want to be doing, but if for some reason you need to trigger a Cypher spell, this is a way to get through, or get those last couple points of damage, or if you have some creature you want to throw away, which isn't really a theme in this set, but you might be able to find some situation where that's useful. This can do all of those things, but really it's mostly just a grizzly bear with a mild upside. Speaking of things that are not things, we have Contaminated Ground. I'm not even going to read this card. It is not a thing. Just barely technically a thing is the Corpse Blockade. 2 colorless and a black for a 1/4 with Defender, and you may sacrifice another creature to have it gain Death Touch until end of turn. So, like Death Touch is kind of neat, but it's a wall, so they have to choose to smash into it, and a Horned Turtle is an okay blocker, but not exceptional, and yeah. Again, if you have some reason to really want to sacrifice stuff, this is a way to do that, but I think this is kind of one of those things that's being seeded for Dragon's Maze. Next up, we have one of the obvious archetype staples in Death's Approach. Single black mana for an aura. Enchanted creature gets -X, where X is the number of creature cards in its controller's graveyard. So this is pretty difficult to use removal. It's very cheap, but it's not easy to set up. And if you're going to go through the work to set it up, you're going to already be in the Dimir deck. So I think this is one of those cards that you can get rather late in the pack for the Dimir Milieu deck because no one else is going to want it. And I think it's the kind of thing that once you have the mill cards, you're going to want a bunch of these so you can stall the game out to finish milling them. In that theme of stalling the game out, we come to a much better removal spell in Devour Flesh. 1 colorless and a black for an instant. Target player sacrifices a creature and gains life equal to that creature's toughness. So, it won't always happen, but sometimes your opponent's just going to have one creature attacking, and you're going to block, and they're going to go for a Blood Rush trigger, and you're going to get a sick 2-for-1. Outside of that situation, this is mostly sort of a awkward, cruel edict that gives them a little life, but on occasion, not often, but on occasion, you're going to need to point this at yourself to gain, say, 4 to 6 life to get yourself out of range of extort triggers or some absurd burn spell on the stack. So it's a cruel edict that sometimes gets an awkward side use, but that's still a pretty solid card. Next we have Dying Wish. This card, just like Contaminated Ground, don't read it, it's not a card, it doesn't matter. Instead, I want to complain about how they changed cards with the name Something Wish from being a sorcery that grabs something sweet out of your sideboard, like the original Cycle or Glittering Wish, and those were sweet and awesome, and instead we have this stupid aura that destroys this trope. Nice job, Wizards. Lacking all sarcasm, actual nice job on the card Executioner's Swing. A white and a black instant. Target creature that dealt damage this turn gets -5/-5 until end of turn. So, this is awkward, but undercosted removal. It's kind of like, well, I couldn't beat your guy in combat, but I'm killing him afterwards. I think this is one of the staple commons for the Orzhov decks. You don't want a ton of this. It's not the kind of removal that gets better when you have multiples, but the first one will probably make your deck always, and the second will sometimes make your deck. Speaking of something that may not make your deck, and for your sake I really hope doesn't make your deck in multiples, we have the Gateway Shade. So it's a Looming Shade that also lets you tap gates to give it +2/+2. If you don't know what Looming Shade does, well, I can't help you, you ignorant heathen child. Anyway, Looming Shade was always pretty marginal. This is even worse because it's in a multicolor set, so you're much less likely to have just all swamps on the board. And the upside of being able to tap gates to give it +2/+2 doesn't do enough to make up for the fact that it's in frickin' Ravnica. This card is pretty goddamn marginal. Don't play it if you can at all avoid it. Something that you want to do the opposite of avoiding, and instead play as much as you can, is Gift of Orzhov. 1 colorless and 2 white and black hybrid mana, and it's an aura that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1, flying, and lifelink. So this comes real close to building you a Baneslayer. Okay, maybe it's closer to building you a Vampire Nighthawk, but both of those are insanely amazing and limited. Vampire Nighthawk makes it to Constructed, so there's plenty of room for a card to be slightly worse than Vampire Nighthawk and still be fantastic. Sometimes you're going to want to slap this on the first creature you have and try to just ride it to victory, and against some opponents, that'll get there. They won't be able to race, and they may not have removal. Against other opponents, you're going to want to save this until it's the killing blow, those last few points to get your one guy in there, plus a couple of extort triggers and take them out. And either way, this card's just awesome. I usually preach about the risks of auras, so if you hear me selling an aura as all upside, you know it's got to be a good one. Speaking of good ones, we have the Grisly Spectacle. 2 colorless and 2 black mana for an instant that is a dark banishing, and then they mill cards equal to that creature's power. So this is pretty freaking sweet. I mean, instant removal. Granted 4 mana, but it's still instant removal for almost anything in the set. And then that mill effect just helps you set up those Dimir mill decks. You want to get as many of this as you possibly can if you're playing a Dimir deck. But even if you're just playing an Orzhov deck, this is still instant speed removal. This is a really good card, and in packs that don't have some busted rare or uncommon, I could see this being a first pick. Going from first pick to last pick, we have the Gutter Skulk. It is a black grizzly bear, which I guess makes it the walking corpse, I think is the term for that. But it's both a zombie and a rat. Woohoo! Zombie rat! Zombie rat! Staying in the vein of unexciting black creatures, we have Horror of the Dim. 4 colorless and a black for a 3/4, and you may pay a blue to give it hexproof. So on-demand hexproof is just so vastly much worse than actual hexproof. And even if this guy had actual hexproof, he'd be Rubbleback right now. So that lets you know kind of where this guy is. I suppose, unlike Rubbleback Rhino, the Dimir decks are probably going to be slightly hurting for creatures that are sort of willing to fight with other decently sized creatures. But at 5 mana, this is not even a Siege Mastodon. So sometimes you're going to need this guy, but I feel bad for you when you do. Another card that I think is awkward in this set, and I think is another seeded card specifically for Gatecrash, is Illness in the Ranks. 1 black mana, enchantment, creature tokens get -1/-1. And this card would have been an outstanding sideboard card back in Return to Ravnica. Actually just phenomenal. This set has far, far, far fewer token makers. I think there might be 3 or 4 in the entire set. So that tells you how often you're going to want to sideboard this in. Next up, we have Killing Glare. It's an instant for an X and a black, destroy target creature with power X or less. So this is going to create an interesting dynamic with Blood Rush, in that if your opponent is going to try to go for a Blood Rush effect, they have to wonder, does he have the Killing Glare? Because whoever moves first on that deal loses. But overall, this is just a solid removal spell. Slightly overcosted, depending on what creatures you're killing, but removal is removal, and you take what you can get. Next up, we have the Kingpin's Pet. White, a colorless, and a black mana for a 2/2 flying with Extort. This is about as good as you can imagine a common being for the Orzhov decks. It puts a clock on your opponent, not an insane clock, but a perfectly fine clock. It's got Extort, which is fantastic, and having those two together, an evasion effect with Extort, is quite strong. I think this is the kind of card that pushes people into Orzhov. And finally, we come to the first Cypher spell. Mental Vapors. 3 colorless and a black. Target player discards a card, and it has Cypher for an uncommon. So the first thing I want to point out is that Cypher spells, when you cast them off the Cyphered creature, do in fact trigger your Extort spells. So that's a synergy to be aware of. It's pretty good. This card is tricky to evaluate, as are all Cypher cards, in that it will not always do the same thing. You have to evaluate it in kind of best case scenarios and worst case scenarios. The best case scenarios is you cast the spell, immediately Cypher it onto some creature, preferably an evasion creature of some kind, hit your opponent, and then cast the spell immediately again. And if you do that, this is, a mind rot that then threatens to, bottomless pit them out of the game. And that's pretty powerful. The worst case scenario, you don't even have a creature that you want to Cypher onto, and then you just spend 4 mana to make them discard a card, which is not even close to playable. So while my evaluation of this card is going to be highly dependent on the context of the rest of your deck and what you're trying to achieve, I think overall this card is just a little bit too difficult to set up for what it pays you off. So I'm not impressed, but I'm willing to reserve judgment on the possibility that I'm wrong. A Cypher spell that I'm much more willing to evaluate is Midnight Recovery. 3 colorless and a black. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and it has Cypher. So unlike the previous Cypher spell, this card does not require your opponent to have cards in hand to be getting value. You do have to have your creatures die. But through the natural course of a game, that's just something that's going to happen. And in particular, in this set, with Battalion and Blood Rush, you're going to want to block. And block early, and trade. And sometimes your opponent will even Blood Rush just to keep their guy on the board and kill yours. And those are trades you're going to want to make. It may seem counterintuitive, but they're worth it. If you trade your Syndic of Tithes for their Zerta Swine, you're up mana and overall card power. The Midnight Recovery allows you to then capitalize on the fact that you've been trading because we're playing an aggressive set. And in particular, if you're hitting with this every turn, it's not unreasonable to imagine that you just never have dead creatures. Every creature you draw is on the board, and you're extorting your opponent constantly. I think this is a pretty strong card. You don't want a ton of it, but I think this is pretty amazing in the Orzhov decks. Amazing is not a word I would use to describe the Millennial Gargoyle. 4 colorless for a 2/2 flying artifact creature. So if you're rather desperate for a flyer, you can have this guy. But he's just overcosted overall and pretty unexciting. Moving along, we have 1,000 Lashes. 2 colorless, a black and a white mana, enchant creature. Enchanted creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be played. And at the beginning of your upkeep, enchanted creature's controller loses 1 life. And it's uncommon. So this is a callback to Pillory of the Sleepless. And if you've ever played with Pillory of the Sleepless, you know how awesome that card is. This card costs 1 more, so it's perhaps slightly less awesome in that regard, but it does prevent their abilities from happening, which makes it a answer to guild mages and the like. I think this is a fantastic removal spell and one of the earlier picks that push you toward an Orzhov deck. Somehow staying with uncommon awesome removal spells for your Orzhov deck, we have Orzhov Charm, a white and a black, and the 3 modes are return target creature you control and all auras you control attached to it to their owner's hand. So this is kind of a saving grasp / rescue. I don't think it comes up too terribly often, but it does once in a while. Second mode is destroy target creature and you lose life equal to its toughness. I think this mode alone would make this card a great, fantastic limited card. Vendetta is awesome. And the third mode, return target creature with converted mana cost 1 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This will obviously happen far less often than the other 2 modes, but when it does happen, when that's what you want to do, it's just sweet that it's optional. So, maybe not the greatest of all the charms, but definitely one you're going to play. Something in this cycle which the Orzhov might have the best of is the Key Rune. Just like the other Key Runes, and it becomes a 1/4 white and black Thrall with lifelink. So a 1/4 lifelink is a pretty sweet defender. Actually just a pretty sweet defender. And extra mana is especially useful in the Orzhov decks, because Extort ends up adding mana to all your spells if you want to pay for it over and over. So the Orzhov decks can use the extra mana, they can use the blocker and the life, and I think this is one of the key runes that fits most especially well into the archetypes its guild wants to play. Up next is the Prophetic Prism. This is a reprint. If you don't remember it, it's a 2 colorless artifact. When it comes into play, you draw a card, and you can filter 1 colorless mana into any color of mana. So this is mana fixing that doesn't come at a cost to your deck, but it does come at a cost to your tempo. So we'll have to see just how fast the set is before we can evaluate how useful this card is, but I would really like to imagine this is a pretty sweet card. Staying the theme of cards that might be too slow, but I wish they'd be sweet, we have Purge the Profane. 2 colorless, a white and a black. Sorcery, target opponent discards 2 cards and you gain 2 life. It's a common. Mind Rot has been kind of a limited staple over and over, and it's depending on what your deck wants to do and the speed of the format. Gaining 2 life kind of offsets the fact that it costs a little bit more mana. But again, just like Prophetic Prism, this is one of those things where it depends how fast the format is, and my suspicion is it's probably too fast. Next up, Razor Tip Whip, 2 colorless artifact, spend 1 and tap it, it deals 1 to target opponent. If you're playing an aggressive deck and you're just completely desperate for reach, I suppose you could reach for this, but it's pretty marginal. Also, I suspect is rather marginal is Riot Gear. 2 colorless, an equipped creature gets +1/+2 and it has an equip cost of 2. So Holy Strength is pretty okay, but this is not the most pushed equipment. We'll have to see how fast the set is, and the faster it is, the worse this gets, but I really don't think this is getting there. It's possible I'm wrong, because equipment is pretty flexible, and if the game goes longer, it can be pretty useful, so maybe In some decks, sometimes this is a good card, but it's not helping you curve out in your Boros deck. It's not smashing in your Grohl deck. It's not evolving your guys. It's just kind of out of place. Also, a little bit out of place is the Shadow Alley Denizen. 1 black for a 1/1 creature. Whenever another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gains Intimidate until end of turn. So if you've never played against Kami of the Waning Moon, it might be difficult to appreciate giving guys Intimidate repeatedly. But unlike Kami of the Waning Moon, Shadow Alley Denizen has to exist in a world full of gold creatures, which makes Intimidate much less effective. So, we'll see. 1/1s don't have to do, or excuse me, 1-drops don't have to do too terribly much to make it, but the Orzhov decks and Dimir decks aren't especially aggressive, so they're less likely to want to spend a card on this, so I just don't see it. Up next is a Cypher spell I think is pretty impressive with Shadow Slice. 4 colorless and a black sorcery, target opponent loses 3 life with Cypher. It's a common, and this will end the game pretty quick in the ideal scenario. You deal 3, you hit with a creature, you deal 3 again. If we assume that creature had, say, 2 power, that's 8 damage in 1 turn and 5 the next. That's 13 in 2 turns. I think this card is just going to kill people, which means it doesn't really make too terribly much sense in your Dimir decks, but killing people's good, so even though it's not helping to mill them, it'll probably still win you some games. And this is probably fantastic in those Orzhov decks, where you have a flyer and a couple blockers, and you put this down and force them to race. Not exciting, though, is Skyblinder's Staff. 1 colorless equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and can't be blocked by creatures with flying, and has an equip cost of 3. I think this is strictly a sideboard card for when your opponent has apparently no creatures but flyers, and you really just want to get through them. Although there aren't too terribly many flyers in this set that happen to line up as also wanting to particularly be blockers, especially not in the early part of the game. So this is just an awkward card. Sensing an awkwardness theme, Slate Street Ruffian, 2 colorless and a black for a common 2/2 human warrior, and whenever Slate Street Ruffian becomes blocked, defending player discards a card. So I know what you're thinking, whoa, I didn't block the Grey Ogre, it's so terrible. But you have to evaluate him in the context of having Cypher cards. And in that context, they may not want to block him or not block him. But either way, he's still a Grey Ogre. So it's not exciting, and really not a card you're going to want very often. Something I think you will want fairly often is Smog Elemental. 4 colorless, 2 black for a 3/3 flyer. Creatures with flying your opponent's control get -1/-1. This is just an obviously good flyer. Shrinking opposing flyers is almost as good as being a 4/4. Not quite, but almost. And sometimes could even be better. So, yeah, this is a pretty sweet guy. Air Elemental, sometimes worse, sometimes better. But can I complain for just a second about anything being an elemental? I mean, smog? Smog's not an element. That's a pollution. There's no element there. It's unnatural, if anything, and elementals are supposed to be the essence of nature made manifest. This is just flavor rage. Flavor rage. Okay. So now we have Syndicate Enforcer. 3 colorless and a black, 3/2 creature with Extort, human rogue, common. Extort is so sweet that I'm willing to say that turning your Warpath Ghoul into I don't even remember what crappy creatures are 3/2s for 4 mana, but they're not exciting, and so Extort has to be pretty good. But I think Extort is pretty good. So not an early pick, but one of those guys you pick up for your Orzhov deck. Speaking of Extort being sweet, we have Thrall Parasite. 1 black for a 1/1 uncommon. Has Extort. You can tap him and pay 2 life to remove a counter from target non-land permanent. So a 1/1 for 1 with Extort would already be about good enough to see play. Granted, you don't want a ton of 1/1s because they tend to get made irrelevant as far as combat goes very, very quickly, but Extort does a very good job of keeping a card relevant later on. And being a single black mana, he can trigger multiple Extort effects when you cast him in the mid-game before you have a ton of lands on the board. And as far as removing counters, well, Evolve is a thing. So this guy is probably not awesome, except when he's awesome. Up next is Undercity Informer. 2 colorless and a black for a 2/3 creature uncommon human rogue with the ability 1 colorless, sacrifice a creature, target player reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals a land card, and puts those into the graveyard. So 2/3 for 3 is already playable. You can play that on a vanilla guy, and it is totally fine most of the time. And this ability, I don't know why we're trying to sacrifice creatures so bad in the Orzhov decks, but milling your opponent, I do understand. And in particular, there is, not to give a spoiler, but there is a demure way to make some additional creatures. And so the Undercity Informer might have some fodder to throw at their library while being a decently sized body. Not a high pick, but an alright pick. Moving along is Vizkopa Confessor. 3 colorless, a black and a white, a 1/3 creature with Extort. And when he enters the battlefield, you can pay any amount of life, and then your opponent reveals that many cards from their hand, and you choose one and exile it. So you probably have to, at turn 5, you pay 1 mana, or excuse me, 1 life, and they probably have to reveal one of their best last few pieces of gas in their hand. And if you're really concerned they have something specific, you can just pay whatever amount of life they have as their hand. So at this point in the game, we're talking about 5 mana. They're probably not having too much more than 3 or 4 cards in hand to just be a coercion, which is pretty sweet, and Extort's pretty sweet, so I think this guy's... I have to apologize. Something very strange happened just now with my PC, so I have to speak over my previous recording. I'm talking about Vizkopa Guildmage, a white and a black for a 2/2, 1 colorless, a white and a black, target creature gains a lifelink until end of turn. Sweet, because Orzhov wants the game to go on. And 1 colorless, a white and a black, whenever you gain life this turn, each opponent loses that much life, which means your Extort triggers are draining them twice as much, which is sweet, and can combine with the first ability to effectively give a creature double strike. Again, totally sweet. This is one of the slower guild mages, but it's in arguably the slowest guild in the set, and I think it does all the things you want to do, and is a pretty early pick pushing you towards Orzhov. And finally, we come to White of Precinct 6. Colorless and a black for a 1/1 uncommon zombie. White of Precinct 6 gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your opponent's graveyards. So this is kind of awkward in that the Dimir mill decks are going to be trying to kill you with mill, not with power, but it is still an undercosted guy in that context, so maybe it's okay. For 2 mana, how big does it really have to be sweet? A 3/3? A 4/4? That'll happen in the mid-game. I don't think this is a high pick, but I think it's one of those cards that you can pick up late and works in your deck. So that completes the Orzhov and Black Cards video. Thanks for watching.